Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the final installment of our Arbor Day webinar series. My name is Gwen Kozlowski, and I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator with the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry Program. We are excited to have many friends of our program on today, but for those of you who are new, the UCF team is a collaborative effort between UVM Extension and the Vermont Department of Forest Parks and Recreation. We provide technical, educational, financial assistance to support communities in stewarding their tree resources. You can learn more about our work at vtcommunityforestry.org. Before I hand it over to Joanne, I've got a few housekeeping items. Your microphones will be muted during the presentation, and there is no video option for participants. If you have questions during the webinar, please put them in the question box in the side panel, and we'll address them after the presentation. If you have any other comments or concerns, feel free to put those in there as well. Credits. This presentation is eligible for one ISA, SAF, or Vermont Forester License CEU. To receive credit, you must fill out the survey at the end of the webinar with your name and license number. The survey will pop up once you exit the webinar and will be emailed to you 1 hour after this presentation. So if for some reason when you click out of the webinar it doesn't show up, you will get an email 1 hour after the presentation ends with the survey. For those of you who are looking for an SAF certificate for Vermont Forester License, I have put the certificate in the handouts box in the side panel, but if you also need to be emailed a certificate, feel free to select yes that you need to be emailed the certificate on the post-webinar survey. This webinar is being recorded and will be available at our website later today, vtcommunityforestry.org. I will also send out the link to anyone who has been registered. And thanks to Joanne Garton, our UCF's own Technical Assistance Coordinator and Rural Road Expert Extraordinaire. I just wanted to do a few quick polls to get a sense of who's in the audience before I hand it over to Joanne to enlighten us on resilient rural roads. So I'm going to launch the first poll and see where folks are located. It'll take about 20 seconds or so to fill this out. Okay, another 5 seconds. All right. And I'll close out this poll. We've got 36% in Northwest Vermont, 21% in Central, a few folks from the Northeast Kingdom and Southern Vermont, and 1 outside Vermont. All right, we'll launch the next one. Who do you represent? Select board member, tree warden, volunteer, municipal staff, or I'm just here to learn a little bit more. We'll take another 20 seconds or so to fill out this poll. Okay, we've got about 3/4 of folks are here to learn a little bit more. We've got a few municipal staff, 1 volunteer and 1 tree warden. And the last question I've got is, what's your familiarity with right-of-way management? I'm very familiar, moderately, or I'm a novice. Another 10 or 15 seconds or so. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close this poll. We've got about half the audience as a novice, about 1/3 moderately familiar, and about 20% I'm familiar. So with that, Joanne Garton, our Technical Assistance Coordinator, take us away.
Thanks, Gwen. Just making sure that I'm sharing my title slide. Gwen?
Correct.
Okay. Well, thanks all for joining me for the next hour to talk a little bit about rural roadside vegetation. And this was something we were hoping to present at our Arbor Day conference back in April that has to be postponed. So this is our kind of online walkthrough of a lot of topics. We won't be able to cover all of them in an hour, but you'll see my contact information at the end of the slideshow to continue any kind of conversation by email or phone call. I'm definitely happy to hear from all of you after the fact. So again, my name is Joanne Garton. I work with the Urban and Community Forestry Program. I'm the Technical Assistance Coordinator based out of Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation. And I am here to talk about a project that actually started before I even worked for the organization about 5 years ago called Resilient Right-of-Ways. And it was an umbrella title for a project funded by grants from the U.S. Forest Service that enabled our program to look at right-of-way vegetation, and we'll kind of get into the specifics momentarily about what the right-of-way really is, but right-of-way vegetation along both urban and rural roads. And as you can imagine, those look pretty different if you're in a city in Burlington, Rutland, Barre, or if you're on a village green in the town center, or if you're on a rural road out in the over 8,000 miles of back roads that cover Vermont. So I have done a lot of work on the rural road side, and that's what we'll be discussing today. It's enabled me to spend field time and time with municipalities, particularly 9 pilot towns in particular, identifying the challenges that we face in right-of-way vegetation management, understanding the sometimes unclear processes that govern the stewardship of this type of vegetation, and enabled me to look for opportunities available to towns as they address changes in their right-of-way vegetation. Changes that are happening either because of direct human action, we're taking down trees, we're planting trees, or more indirectly because of an increase in both forest pest, invasive insect activity, and invasive plant spread. So, advancing to the next slide, the Vermont Backroad. I like to show this picture a lot. It's one that I snapped in, I think in Calais, and it's just a really clear picture of what our Vermont backroads can look like. They have, this particular one is quite flat and clear and straight. They don't all look like this. So just kind of, I do have a lot of nice pictures to share with you today. So I'll take you through a few of those to start, of just what our backroads can look like and why there's not a one-size-fits-all for vegetation management in the right-of-way. On the right now, you see another pretty typical Vermont backroad where there's softwoods on the left-hand side of the road. And then on the right-hand side, a series of hardwood trees, but also a utility line that passes down the side of the road. And it's really governing how those trees are pruned or managed and what grows underneath them. Vermont backroads can also look like this, maybe hay fields with varying levels of mature maple trees along the side of the road. It can look like this, agriculture. Here's cornfields all the way up to the edge of the right-of-way, but certainly any kind of agriculture, corn, hay, alfalfa. I've certainly seen cows right next to the road, horses. There's a lot going on in the rural land use alongside our unpaved roads. Sometimes the right-of-way looks a bit like this. We are certainly managing for drainage in our right-of-way. The idea for the road crews is always to get water off the road as quickly as possible. And that often has to be managed in ditches, culverts, stone line ditches, stone turnouts alongside of the road, often at the expense of trees. We have roadsides that go through ecologically sensitive areas, right through wetlands or ponds. These can be some of our smallest and least traveled roads, but not always. Beautiful spots to look at and see, but again, very, very sensitive ecologically. And then certainly a picture like this, those classic maple-lined farmhouse roads that are not only essential to us to understand our sense of place, but also quite honestly attract tourist dollars. That, of course, is pre-pandemic, but why some people come to Vermont to drive our roads and look at our maple trees on our farms. This is a road actually in Hyde Park where they're working to really prune and manage those maple trees for as long as they possibly can, because it's actually a pretty popular tourist destination in their town. So let's back up a moment and talk a little bit about the right-of-way. Back to my straightforward picture of the right-of-way. It sounds like on the poll there are a couple of you that know about the right-of-way, but many of us are just learning. So speaking very generally, and most of our presentation today is quite general, we're looking at typical scenarios. The right-of-way generally extends 3 rods. This is a municipal right-of-way, so the town-owned right-of-way. And for those of you who don't work in rods, that's about 49.5 feet. A rod is 16.5 feet. So 49.5 feet wide, or roughly 25 feet from the center line of the road. Now, the right-of-way in a town generally does not move, but the road can move over time. So that measurement of 25 feet from the center line of the road is, again, a rough measurement. Private landowners, whether that's an individual person or family, or a town or a state government or a federal government, whoever it is that actually owns land in this town, does generally own the land underneath the road. The town owns an easement, or a right to use the land and manage it for the purposes of having a road. So that's not only the traveled road surface itself, keeping it safe and passable, but it includes the right to manage vegetation. And for most purposes today, we're talking about trees as vegetation, although not always. So managing vegetation in the right-of-way, of course, with due process and adherence to the Vermont tree warden statutes and the Vermont highway statutes, which we'll dig into a little bit later, but those are state statutes that govern what happens in certain parts of our right-of-way. So for me, as I've done a lot of field work looking around roads, I've kind of divided the right-of-way into a few different sections. There's namely the traveled surface of the road. And that is what we need to drive on, and hopefully it's relatively smooth, although not always, as we know, during mud season. On either side of that, not always, but usually, there is some kind of cleared zone. And these are areas that are mowed or brush hogged. They may be hardscaped in some way with stone lining. And they're areas that most towns maintain to keep a line of sight alongside the road, also provide storage for snow in the winters, and provide a place for us to pull off the road safely if we need to in a sense of emergency in that time. And then what's kind of left over is what I call the manageable vegetation. And this is what is a really weird part of this publicly managed land, that it's these really thin strips along both sides of a road. And that, a traveled road surface can be as small as 12 feet. It can be as big as over 30 feet wide. And so the manageable vegetation, or what's left over, could be as small as nothing. The road surface takes up the entire right-of-way with the cleared zone. Or I've seen it, as wide as almost 20 feet, which is a pretty wide strip of forest, if that's something the town is managing. All of these items happen in this 49.5 feet. Now that's 3 rods. Some towns do have right-of-ways that are wider than this, 4 rods, 5 rods. I even worked in one town where they had a 10-rod right-of-way, so that's 165 feet wide due to a past military use along that part of the town. That's certainly the exception. In general, the municipal right-of-way is 49.5. So one of the items that we've worked on through this Resilient Right-of-Way project is work with 10 pilot towns, understanding their processes, their roadside vegetation, the different pieces and elements that make up their rural roads, and providing them all with action plan reports of things they can consider for their towns as they manage roadside vegetation. And ultimately creating this guidebook. And the guidebook is just about finished. It's off to design phase right now, and will likely be physically in our hands by July. So what I'm going to spend most of our time together is kind of running through what's in that guide and the types of things that we can cover and how they overlap. And the guide is broken into two parts. And this first part gets into what I'm calling the elements of the back road. So things that you see along Vermont backroads that are fairly typical and that really govern what happens, what the task of the town is to manage this vegetation, and what the outside influences are that govern what we see. The second part of the guide gets to all these processes and hopefully kind of the action items that you as select board members, as conservation commission members, tree warden, volunteers, maybe even someone who's involved with the road crew, or just a citizen scientist or landowner things that are all kind of overlap to involve a lot of the management in the rural road right-of-way. But we'll start with some pictures, a lot of pictures here of elements of the back road. And there are 10 that I've identified. As you can imagine, there are probably a lot more. But these are kind of top 10 that really cropped up everywhere that involved us examining and outlining in the guidebook with some general practices and resources, linking you to other people and partners and technical resources that you might need as you think about some of these elements on the back road. So that first one is the manageable vegetation width. And we discussed that just a moment ago in the previous slide. So really understanding what width of vegetation your town is managing and what's in that. Is it mature forest? Is it immature forest? Is it agriculture? Is it wetland? Is it bare soil? Is it steeply sloped or not? These are all kind of questions that a town can look at to understand what they're really in charge of along the rural road right-of-way. And even a small town of a couple hundred people can have 50, 60, 70 miles of rural road. And so it's quite a big lift to think about all that land. The second one I want to address are utilities. So these are certainly a common part of our rural road landscape. Often that municipal right-of-way is shared with a utility company. They have similarly a right-of-way to manage the roadside vegetation to allow their lines to carry down the road. Their rules governing roadside vegetation are slightly different than the towns, but ultimately the idea is that they're keeping their lines up in the air and maintaining a huge bubble of safety around those lines. Certainly no one should ever be working within 10 feet with branches or trees within 10 feet of the power lines unless you're a arborist who's certified to work around power lines. And if there's ever any doubt about the safety of managing trees near power lines, you should absolutely be contacting the utility companies first. But these utilities, that photo on the left you see is a roadside in town of Stowe, I believe. You see a bunch of knotweed on the bottom, Japanese knotweed, an invasive plant. Some dead elms and ash trees are alongside this road. And just below those trees is a river. This is a super challenging stretch of road to manage and is really kind of done in concert with the utility company and the town. They're not easy strips of vegetation along roadsides to understand and are frequently cleared by the utility companies on rotations, often every 7, 8, 10 years. So utilities, a big element of our rural roadsides landscape. Ash trees. We'll talk a little bit more about ash trees later, but even prior to the emerald ash borer being confirmed in Vermont in early 2018, we always imagined that understanding where ash trees are along your rural road and how big they are and who manages them would always be important, knowing that emerald ash borer was coming. And it has certainly taken up a big focus of our work in the last 2+ years of moving from preparedness for emerald ash borer into management. Emerald ash borer, for those who aren't familiar, here's a photo. It's an invasive beetle from Southeast Asia. Our species of ash in Vermont and New England, white, green, and black ash, are threatened by emerald ash borer. And in general, as the broad brush statement, it does kill over 99% of our ash trees. So understanding ash trees, which are very common Vermont forest tree, where they are and how they might act when infested with EAB, which is, can fly up to 1 or 2 miles a year, and that's how it spreads. But more commonly, it does, as it does in this photo, it hops in the back of a truck in some firewood or ash wood packaging material and is transported tens or hundreds of miles in one trip and hops out in a new forest. So ash tree management along our rural roadside is becoming a large deal. The cost of dealing with dead and dying ash trees will be borne by municipalities. And so we're working heavily with towns on ash tree inventories and management plans. So if anyone wants to talk about that more for their town, you're welcome to reach out to me after the webinar. Incidentally, the insect itself is less than ½ an inch long, not actually human-sized. This tree, I feel like this is a really common Vermont roadside tree. And we talk about mechanical damage to roadside trees. Now this can happen because of a plow, a mower, It could be a acute incident, a crash with a vehicle and a tree. As you can imagine, it's often from repeated damage. And I am just amazed how many injuries there are to roadside trees, and yet how resilient these trees are. They come out in full canopy every year. And as a town, it's important to kind of note where these are, note what the problems are, and just acknowledge that these trees are not completely healthy, and their future will be a little more tenuous than, for example, a resilient and whole maple or oak on the side of a road. So this to me is, yeah, definitely a classic Vermont tree. Something else we see in the right-of-way, two things really here, is agriculture. I mentioned that earlier. We can see it all the way up into the right-of-way, or up to a buffer of where the right-of-way ends and the private land management begins. It is not uncommon to see agriculture in the right-of-way, and I can say that the town does have management rights in the right-of-way. Technically, it could decide that they would like to see something different in this thin strip of land between the road and the edge of the right-of-way. But often some of this agriculture has been here for a long time. Sometimes it's mutually beneficial between a farmer and the road crew, who may not have to mow that part of the road because the farmer is doing it, or even a landowner who has a yard all the way up to the edge of the road that they mow. But it is something to consider as an element of the back road, and how we can manage that differently if we so choose. On the right there is a cedar hedgerow, likely planted by a homeowner. I don't remember actually measuring to tell you if it is specifically within 25 feet of the center line of the road or just over. But I did do a lot of work identifying hedgerows, whether they were intentionally planted like this cedar hedgerow, or if they had grown up accidentally. For example, something that used to be a pasture, suddenly the animals were taken away and the hedgerows grew up to form, a visual barrier that maybe a landowner or a homeowner appreciates for privacy, or for migration of animals or birds through this hedgerow. But also places where hedgerows, again, may be obscuring a beautiful view that some older residents remember seeing, and just developing these standards around understanding where hedgerows are accidental and may not be the best idea, particularly if it's a hedgerow of invasive plant species or trees, versus a hedgerow like the one you see on the right here, where if the town decided to remove that for some reason, and the homeowner came home that day and found their fence gone, essentially, that would be a huge problem to fix, and it certainly couldn't be fixed quickly. So noting where hedgerows are and the importance they play for both the town in mitigating snowdrift and privacy, and perhaps even stormwater filtration, and then perhaps where they don't need to be anymore. Another element of the Vermont Backroad are what I just called historic trees, and there's no scientific definition from my perspective for what these historic trees are, but they're trees that were most likely intentionally planted. They're big markers and wayfarer markers along our roads, and would certainly be missed if they were taken down by the town without any kind of public process. Just noting their health and understanding perhaps who can monitor their health, whether that's the neighboring landowner or the town tree warden, or the town tree warden in concert with the road foreman, who may take a drive every year to look at the health of some of these trees and what pruning or removal may need to happen to keep these roadways safe. And similarly, to think about where there are opportunities to plant new trees that may be the future historic trees of these roads. Because certainly, even if these trees remain healthy with no outside threats, they are aging and eventually won't be there one day. So planning for that next generation is an important element of part of the scenic beauty of our back roads. We have 3 more elements here: invasive plants. So we could talk a long time about invasive plants, particularly along roadsides. We have, some fairly common ones in Vermont: species of honeysuckle, buckthorn, Japanese knotweed, wild chervil, poison parsnip, garlic mustard. The list goes on for a while. Here are just a few. That's honeysuckle on the left, Japanese knotweed on the right, which is a real problem for road crews too, because it grows so quickly and so large and can obscure signs, safety and sight lines. I like this photo in the middle was a landowner who decided to try to pull wild chervil out of the right-of-way rather than have it be mowed. And we'll talk a little bit more about mowing and how that can spread invasives in an effort to get rid of wild chervil along the roadsides before it spreads into the neighboring farm fields. Generally, livestock won't eat this plant. So a huge discussion about invasive plants. VTinvasives.org is a great website that we maintain that deals with a lot of different management strategies for particular invasive plants. And that information is in our guide and also linked out to websites, and they're pretty extensive work on invasive species management. Another element of the backroad are trees that we want to consider preserving. You can see on the left here some trees that are really the last resort for this steep slope and are, for better or worse, almost acting as a safety barrier. There are certainly times when a guardrail may be required, but thinking about tree preservation in your town, there's a lot of reasons to take down trees, whether for aesthetics, for cultural reasons, for safety, for putting in ditches, for sight lines. There are also reasons to save trees, and we know there's a lot of benefits to stormwater infiltration, even canopy cover, protecting the road surface from just raindrops and erosion via just impact from rain. And certainly in a spot like this one on the left, you'll see that when these trees do eventually come down, whether on their own accord or they're taken down, it'd be a very challenging spot to grow new trees to stabilize the bank and even provide an element of visual demarcation along the road. Similarly, on the right, you see some trees that are just a thin strip of land bordering a road and a pond. Not only is that helping to filter stormwater and providing some shade on the water's edge, but does also help mark the edge of the road for drivers, particularly at night, who are needing to see where they're driving along our unpaved roads. So we've looked for opportunities in towns where there are specific stretches or even specific trees that we do want to mark as important to preserve as kind of no-cut zones on steep slopes, bordering water edge, or even particularly culturally important trees, visually important trees. And our last element for now are the opposite side of the spectrum, short-lived or crowded trees. This photo on the left I have is, I think it's an aspen that was a victim of a windstorm. And often aspens, I was looking for a picture of a paper birch and I couldn't find one in my files. But there are some trees that just don't live as long as others, even in their healthiest, incarnation. They're maybe living decades rather than hundreds of years. And when we think about maintenance practices along rural roads, on a general sense, having trees that are long-lived is going to be easier for the town. They're doing less maintenance. They're able to grow into mature trees that don't need constant clearing or pruning. But certainly identifying what I called short-lived trees, pin cherries, paper birches, that will not live very long and are some of these pioneer species in our forests, are worth noting, just because there may be more maintenance needs along those stretches of road that were more recently cleared compared to a more mature forest. Kind of the partner in this topic are these crowded trees. This isn't a very technical term, but as we know, much of our Vermont landscape was cleared pasture, and some of it has regrown into forests very recently. So that middle picture there, you see just this web of stick-thin trees, and not all of those trees can grow to be mature, resilient roadside trees. If this were the deep forest and we left it to its own devices, nature would choose those trees on its own. But for roadside trees, there is some reason to think about thinning out less desirable species and also looking for trees that are healthy, that can grow into mature trees if that's what we want to see along that stretch of road, a tree canopy. It's pretty unlikely that many towns will invest money in what we're calling treescaping, thinking about which trees can become the next generation of healthy roadside trees. But it is something to think about. And certainly whenever you clear a roadside, you kind of work yourself back to step one of working with forest pioneer species, early successional species that tend not to live as long as some of our late successional species. We'll move to the second half of this guide. And unfortunately, this is sort of not as many nice pictures, but I think information that is important to share and think about, particularly with all of you. There are a lot of partners involved in roadside tree maintenance, and there are only so many things we can do at once, not only because of budget concerns, but also just capacity. Many small towns have a small population. A lot of this type of stewardship work, whether on roadsides or anywhere in the town, is often a volunteer effort. And I want to recognize that, you know, it becomes the story in every town is slightly different depending on what your landscape is, who your partners are, and what time you might have as a town to invest in roadside tree stewardship. So again, I've got 10 items here, just it's a nice round number, and things that have come up a lot as questions from the pilot towns I've worked with of, well, what should we do about this? How can we fix that? What's the best practice regarding XYZ? So we'll go through a few of these processes for stewardship of the Vermont Backroad. The first one that I'll address is developing a tree ordinance or a tree policy. So the basic tenet for publicly managed trees, and those may be trees on publicly owned land, for example, town land, village greens, certainly urban areas along roadsides, but also now these right-of-way trees, which the tree itself generally is considered to belong to the landowner, but the management of it is a public process. This is mostly governed by the Vermont tree warden statutes, and some of you may be familiar with them. I know we said there was one tree warden in the audience today. They are statutes that were written in the early 1900s, 1904, I think, so they're over 100 years old. They went through one small revamp in 1969 and are currently under discussion at the State House in the legislature this year to be updated, but currently none of those updates have rolled out. So as it stands, the original Vermont tree warden statutes outline the purview of the Vermont tree warden in each town over to have management over shade and ornamental trees in public ways and places in the residential part of town. Many of those terms are not defined, and because they date back to 1904, when we perhaps had, you know, concise or tight village centers with shade and ornamental trees surrounded by farmland and then surrounded by forest, you know, we see a big change in what our town landscape looks like now. Our residential part of town could be anywhere really, and we have a lot more forest than we did in 1904. So the tree warden, every town is required to have a tree warden. It's generally a volunteer position, and it may be held by a person with great forestry or arborist expertise. It may be someone who's already an employee of the town, like someone on the select board, or, well, probably not someone on the select board. It could be the road commissioner. It could be, you know, a person who already works for the town. But really, you know, you may not know your tree warden, but there should be one in your town. And we can help connect you with your tree wardens as best as possible if you don't know who that is. But when it comes to trees in the rural road right-of-way, it's certainly a gray area whether the tree warden has purview over these trees, particularly when they're healthy. We're talking now about preemptive removal of healthy ash trees prior to emerald ash borer arriving. And this definitely opens up a whole public process that governs, you know, whether or not landowners, town residents can or should be able to weigh in on any of these removals. A tree ordinance or tree policy allows a town to take the Vermont tree warden statutes as a baseline and form it to essentially what best suits their town, as long as they're not contradicting existing statutes. And this could be assigning different roles and responsibilities or reactions to trees by location, by size, by species. It really gets into some, you know, town-specific goals of what the town residents want to see their roads look like in the future. Because certainly any forestry practices we do now will take decades to unfold. So we have this, it's actually a 2-pager. You're seeing the front page on your screen now. Guidance on just what a tree ordinance or tree policy is. And our program also has a workbook forming, help you write a tree ordinance or tree policy for your town. It's not a quick process. There has to be a lot of public consensus, but it is an option that we can help guide you through and is perfectly viable for understanding tree management in your town. Our second process, we mentioned ash trees earlier, and certainly preparing for emerald ash borer and managing ash tree health is a huge deal right now, as we see more and more confirmed locations of emerald ash borer. Many towns are looking at and conducting roadside ash inventories, and that's something that I can help you with, either a pen and paper version, or we have an app, a digital version that allows towns, largely volunteers, to go out and inventory the types where ash trees are along the rural roads and who manages them. Are they in the municipal right-of-way, so the town manages them? Are they in the utility right-of-way? Are they on private land but could somehow have an impact on the road? So this has been a big sort of hook for getting people out and walking their roads, identifying ash trees along with all the other kinds of amazing plants and trees you'll see along your rural roads, and thinking about the impact when emerald ash borer arrives in your town, and almost all of these trees succumb to it and are dead and dying and breaking trees along the roadside. And we have towns that have honestly upward of over 3,000 ash trees over 4 inches diameter in their right-of-way. Certainly no small task, and the Vermont Agency of Transportation similarly is working on their inventory and management strategies of something that we wished we didn't have to do, but unfortunately we'll have to address as emerald ash borer spreads through the state. So that brings us kind of in tandem to addressing hazard trees with the tree warden. So independent of emerald ash borer, there are always some trees that might look a little bit like this one on your screen. They are, we've got a lot of standing dead elm, but trees will die for all kinds of reasons, age or just the general hard life that happens along a roadside. And a lot of towns ask questions about liability and logistics of managing hazard trees, risk trees like this. And keep in mind that towns have different level of risk tolerance. And in order for a tree to present risk, it needs to have a target. So something that it would fall on, whether that's property or a person or a passing by car, in order to be risky. Now, trees along our roadsides inherently pose more of a risk than a tree deep in the woods. So towns do worry about, well, if we identify them all, how are we going to manage them? We don't have much budget to deal with this. What if, are we going to be liable? And there's a lot of different legal questions behind that I can't dive too deeply into because I'm not a lawyer, but I can tell you in general that having a plan is better than having no plan at all. So if the tree warden, and again, perhaps that tree warden can team with the road foreman to take a drive once a year, look at where some of these hazards are, and think about how the town could address them, particularly if it's in concert with other roadside construction happening. And being reasonable about expertise, about budget, and capacity to deal with risk trees, whether that's removing them entirely or pruning them, and looking carefully around those risk trees. Are there other trees that could be great candidates for resilient future roadside trees? So that's another process that we share a little guidance on, and just also some pictures about how to identify risk trees in general. This one's pretty obvious, but there are many, particularly when you're in a forest, there's a lot of other trees to look through to find some of these risk trees. Knowing your partners and understanding their goals. So there are really, I've mentioned many people that work some form on roadside vegetation, and whether intentionally or not. We've talked about the tree warden, who may be involved at different levels in your town. Certainly the road crew, the road foreman, the road commissioner are making a lot of decisions about roadside vegetation to get their job done. And as their equipment sizes change, as their town has different requirements about what they want to see on different roads, as traffic increases, there are a lot of decisions to make about roadside vegetation that may not all be made, with a big public process. The select board is guiding the road crew and guiding the funding decisions of the road crew. So they're another body that is weighing in on what it looks like on these rural roads. Any type of volunteer commission, conservation commission, tree board, citizen scientists who are interested in what's going on in their roadsides, whether that's tree species, invasive plants, invasive insects, bird nesting sites, connectivity to other forest blocks. There are all kinds of people who are volunteering to look at land management in their town and would in some way be interested in what's going on in the right-of-way. More regionally, you've got regional planning commissions. They're often out helping with road erosion inventories, understanding where road erosion is happening and what that means for neighboring water and vegetation. They sometimes have aid they can give for mapping, helping towns create maps of different priorities. And then similarly, to some extent, state bodies, whether it's us, Urban and Community Forestry, or any of our co-workers at Forest Parks and Recreation, Fish and Wildlife, who may be looking at habitat requirements, wetland delineation in the Department of Environmental Conservation, all the way up to Agency of Agriculture, looking at pesticide application. There's a lot of, state partners invested in what's happening roadsides. And then, lastly, and certainly very importantly, are just the private landowners, you in your town, invested in that part of your property that is what you may look at every day as you drive in and out of your driveway and up and down your road. It can often be the forest that we all see the most on our commute. Back when we used to do commutes and we're not all working at home. So understanding all those partners and what their roles are is really important to kind of get a handle on who's who in stewardship of these areas in your town. Supporting diverse and native roadside trees and plants. I put up a picture of one of my favorite plants here. It could have really been anything. This is jewelweed, a common roadside plant, particularly in ditches, Impatiens canadensis, I believe. Just a really neat, finely native plant that grows along our roadsides commonly. Just kind of understanding that these roadsides are perpetually disturbed places in terms of their ecology. They're not, because of road construction, they often have a engineered topography. The species that you see there are not necessarily the species that were there when that land was forest or pasture or wetland. And understanding that whatever action happens on your road, whether that's clearing, clearing for ditching or clearing certain trees or clearing for road, stone turnouts, planting roadside.
Oh, Joanne, sorry to interrupt you, but looks like the sound cut out. Oh, Joanne.
To do today.
Oh, hey, Joanne.
A couple more here in our.
Joanne?
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you, but you just cut out for about 2 minutes.
Ah, okay.
I'm not sure if people can just confirm that in the chat that everyone else that was out for 2 seconds or 2 minutes or so. If anyone can just confirm that for me, type in the chat. But yes, it was out for a few folks. So if you could just repeat what you did the last minute or two.
Sure. Sorry about that, folks.
Okay, it's been going great so far.
Okay, thanks, Gwen. I will back up to very briefly go over, I'm guessing I was somewhere around know your partners, just the different types of groups. You heard that?
Yes.
And support diverse and native roadside trees and plants. Just got to basically how what we do now, what we clear now, is really affected by land use history, and that these roadside areas are particularly unnatural communities, engineered topography, different road species, different plant and tree species than were initially there, particularly when it comes to planting roadside grasses. Was that all okay, Gwen? You could hear me?
Yes, good to go, and we're at 10:44.
Thanks. I'll keep my chat open, so if anyone sees that me cut out again, you can just hopefully write in a chat, and hopefully I will see it. A couple of other just elements, or sorry, processes, stewardship processes. I actually don't see anything in the chat, Gwen, so you'll have to let me know.
Yeah, I will.
Roadside mowing policy. Now that's something a few towns have asked for and gets to the heart of how invasive plants are spread. And in our guide, we have a kind of a little calendar of invasive plant phenology, which has to do with when plants flower, when they go to seed. Kind of a very broad brush is that once a plant goes to seed, if you then run the mower down the road, all those seeds will get stuck in every little nook and cranny of our road equipment and will get carried down the road. And certainly roadside construction and mowing is a big vector for invasive plant spreading. Similarly, most towns do not use herbicides. It requires a series of certifications and can be really uncomfortable for some people, but it is possible. Some towns do use them. And we review kind of understanding how that works, who you need to contact, what is allowed and what isn't, and who can do that work safely. Is a big part of another process of managing our roadside vegetation. Noting where your invasive plants are and what they are can help guide how to manage them, but also noting where they aren't is also really important in your town, so that when you're mowing, you're not mowing the invasive plants first and then ending up in that part of town last and spreading the plants. So this is something that a lot of citizen scientists work on. I use iNaturalist a lot, which is just an app that allows you to collect point data on all kinds of things, any living thing. I happen to use it a lot for invasive plants. So we talk about roadside mowing and how kind of some towns have a budget to mow more than once in a year and what that can look like in their town. Oh yeah, I pulled up this picture too. So mowing can look a lot like this one, where you see just mowing up to the edge of the road, almost to bare road. This is also mowing. In some towns, road crews use the flail mower to put it up, straight into the trees to do some really fast pruning. And as you can imagine, this isn't a sound way to prune your trees. It causes a lot of damage, but it does happen, and it is just kind of another method of tree management to address in your town. Generally not recommended, but that is something that you can establish that maybe avoiding in your town mowing policy. A couple more, understanding the role of trees in updated stormwater regulations. Some of you may have heard of the Municipal Road General Permit, which is a recent development from the Department of Environmental Conservation addressing sediment and nutrient runoff from roads, which collectively actually form a large part of our non-point source solution in pollution in Vermont. You see a picture of some ditching along a roadside, and that is a pretty common practice now for dealing with roadside runoff in steeply sloped areas. And it's also something that the state is funding to a certain extent through loans and grants. Now, the Municipal Road General Permit is intentionally vague when it comes to trees. There is nothing in there that says you must cut down all your trees. So I'll just kind of clarify that to start. But it is a concern that in order to have a ditch, you may need to remove trees. And how do we start to weigh whether the trees were playing a good role in mitigating stormwater runoff and erosion control, or if clean water actually looks a little more like this photo, that it is a ditch that is slowing sediment runoff. And if we want to have roads and clean water, where that balance of hardscaping and ditching can balance with mature trees that are providing also a lot of ecological benefits. So we've got a section in the guide on all of those regulations and who to contact about how that works and what is regulated by the state and what really is up to the town. I'm definitely curious to hear more about towns that have tried other approaches than just long straight ditches. There are stone turnouts, there are plunge pools, there are different ways to have stormwater runoff in isolated locations instead of ditches all the way down the road. So feel free to reach out to me about that too. Another item to talk about is maintaining back roads and ditches to specifications. So there are a lot of things to know if you're a road foreman, and I've been learning them slowly through the years. I am not a road crew or road foreman member, but certainly one of the big things is that, you know, a road that's properly crowned and doesn't have berms on the side of the road allows sheet flow into the forest. These all make passable and safe roads, as well as generally healthy vegetation. So I'm hoping one day to be able to organize some workshops on road crew, you know, road maintenance for people who aren't road crew people. I think that'd be really useful for all of us to understand what our road crew, which may only be 2 or 3 people, are doing each and every day to maintain all these roads, and how we can kind of have a happy medium of sharing a language between tree preservation and conservation, and then infrastructure maintenance. And I see, Gwen, we're at 9 minutes left.
Correct.
The last 2 are create and maintain a public relations plan. Now, this sounds like fairly big deal, and it may be, but it ultimately may be something that your town already has to a certain extent. So if you were to cut down a bunch of trees decide to cut down a bunch of trees along a road, you can imagine that the people in your town may be interested. And those could be all kinds of people, school groups and conservation commissions. It could be a top photo of people who did a lot of ash inventories in some towns. You know, there are a lot of people who will really notice what happens on a roadside. And so having some established channels in your town, whether those are a bulletin or front porch forum or social media, really helps people understand what current initiatives are, allows them to weigh in ahead of time, and lets people have a channel to air their grievances. That's not just, say, yelling at their tree warden or their road foreman. There are usually some more productive ways to have a discussion about concerns before they become a big problem. So we have a little bit of guidance on that and what that can look like, even in a really simple way, to keep people informed of vegetation concerns, but also other road concerns, say tree blowdowns, spills, chemical spills or gas spills, washouts, all sorts of things that apply to all road users in a town. And lastly, this is just unrelated photo, but just a happy person with a tree. But the item is to keep abreast of funding opportunities. There are many, they are always changing. Some are small. We give out some Caring for Canopy grants every year that help towns work on their tree plans, their whole town, including in rural road right-of-ways. Others are larger grants coming through Department of Environmental Conservation Clean Water Initiative, or even Agency of Agriculture, or even all the way up to Agency of Commerce and Community Development, looking at placemaking and how trees play a part of that. So I've got a running list of the most current sources of funding that I can find. But again, those do tend to change every year. So we'll kind of wrap up with just a few quick things here. 3 scenarios. So the guide kind of outlines things into certain chunks of different elements you'll see, different processes you might like to know about. But ultimately, when you get out on a road, many of these elements and processes overlap. So I wanted to just show you 3 examples, if I think we have just enough time, where we can discuss what types of things a town might be thinking about on a roadside. So this first one here is back to winter, back to snow, is a roadside where you see a hedgerow of trees bordering a home. What you can't quite tell from this picture, but I can tell you, and the reason I had to go back in the winter to check it out, was that they are all ash trees. So some of the elements we're looking at on this road are this roadside ash tree impact. These will all be affected by emerald ash borer. That there is a hedgerow location. Without these ash trees, there's not much ability to see, to have other trees grow up immediately in that area. And you also can't see, but I noticed in my summer field studies, there were invasive plant species. So if you're in there taking down trees, you may be also getting invasive plant seeds or fragments on your equipment. So stewardship processes that might be at work here are preparing for emerald ash borer, addressing hazard trees with the town tree warden if some of these trees are infested, developing a tree ordinance or policy. How can the town react to ash trees dying along their roadsides? Is there a policy that the town wants to discuss ahead of time regarding ash tree removal, understanding that now, according to the Vermont tree warden statutes, the town is technically not able to take down healthy ash trees without a public hearing. And then, of course, creating and maintaining a public relations plan. You can imagine this landowner might like to know what's going on with trees in the right-of-way before someone shows up with some equipment. Another scenario, this is, I called it a road of the deep woods, and pretty common in Vermont. We see some softwoods, a steeply sloped road. Definitely, I can assure you this hole is up in Calais. It's a heavily forested road. Some elements we might be looking at are that the manageable vegetation width. This is actually a pretty narrow road. There's quite a lot of forest there, which means and it borders an intact forest. There may be a lot of reasons to leave these trees up, not only for slope stability, but also ecological impact as they are creating that forest edge. Roadside ash impact, you can't see here, but most of the ash, for whatever reason, were on the downhill side of the road. So we're hoping that as these ash trees decline, they will mostly not fall into the road, although that will depend on wind and ice. Talk a bit about tree preservation and noting that there really were not many invasive plants along this stretch of road, and hopefully trying to keep it that way. Stewardship processes, you see there's a small amount of ditch and a slope that may erode quickly. So understanding stormwater regulations and what help the town could get both financially and technically to manage stormwater runoff. There was a big pile of gravel down at the bottom of this slope to show that certainly road runoff is happening. As you form a ditch, you may be cutting tree roots, so addressing hazard trees with the tree warden in the future may be an important process. And then back to that mowing policy, I mentioned there were not a lot of invasive plants along this stretch of road. Is this a stretch of road that can be mowed less or mowed first so as to avoid spreading invasive plants via mowing equipment? And lastly, I've got kind of a neat one here is agriculture in the right-of-way. This is the west side of a road in Teignmouth, Vermont. And here's the right side. You see a utility overhead. Going back to the left side, the west side. The town tree warden here, or sorry, road foreman, noted there was a lot of snowdrift on these roads. They really struggle with it. Once the corn is harvested, we just have a big field and prevailing winds. So talking about all kinds of approaches to managing snowdrift with existing vegetation, even going so far as asking or even paying a landowner to leave up 10, 12 rows of corn between 50 and 100 feet from the road to act as this living snow fence. For roads, vegetation does play an important role in managing snowdrift. And the town has enough of a problem with it that they were willing to investigate some new options. We took that idea from a publication from Minnesota where they were dealing with possibly more snow than us. So thinking about the placement and style of roadside vegetation, and then also the seasonal changes in roadside vegetation. So, elements here are agriculture, maybe not many invasive plants in the agriculture, although I did notice on the other side of the road some poison parsnip. You've got an overhead utility on the other side of the road, so there's definitely some things we need to consider about the vegetation under that utility. And then, stewardship processes, again, back to that tree ordinance or policy, mowing policies, addressing snowdrift, and definitely knowing your partners. The misspelling there, partners, but it should be certainly the private landowner, the farmer, the utility, and the town, the people who are using this and are dealing with the snowdrift each winter and the safety hazard. One slide to show you, and I think we'll wrap up right on time, is I mentioned the guide a couple times. We're just about ready to publish this summer. This is our Resilient Right-of-Ways page on our website that you can steer to in a few different ways on our urban and community forestry program. You're welcome to look through that. There's an article that we submitted about our project last year, a short video, and then all the draft and final plans that have gone out to our pilot towns this summer, these past 2 years, in addition to some work of Resilient Right-of-Ways research in the urban right-of-way, which we didn't discuss today. And very last is just a way, my contact information, and I'm sure Gwen will be able to share that with you too, regarding questions, thoughts, whether it was something in this presentation or something that you're thinking about for your town. Nature is complicated. There's never sort of one magic solution for any one spot, but certainly a lot of elements and common practices we can think about together as we try and steward these pretty unusual strips of publicly managed lands. Right at 11.
Great, thank you, Joanne. I told everyone that you were the rural road extraordinaire. I know it's 11 o'clock, so if you need to hop off, please feel free, but we do have a few questions that Joanne, if you're willing to stay for another 5 minutes to answer.
Absolutely.
We'll work on that. So the first one is from Michael Quinn. Where should the right-of-way data be archived in each community? Do you have an answer for that?
I think so. So the only place that I know it's archived would be in your town clerk offices. And so of course that doesn't make it super easy to find. That may, it may be online in your town, but probably not. It may involve a trip to the town clerk. And in some places, people may not even know. So I think the general assumption is 49.5 feet. The town offices would have the right of way along each road.
Great, thank you.
It's not archived at the state at any level, as far as I know.
Great. This is from Virginia. What is the standard utility right-of-way distance, and how do towns and utilities share management of lines along roads? That is a difficult question, but feel free to tackle it.
Yeah, sure. So the utility right-of-way, so that width varies depending on the type of line that's there, whether it's I used to have it all at the tip of my tongue, but if it's a transmission line, if it's a distribution line, I may not be completely correct, but I'm going to say that at minimum, the utility right-of-way tends to be about 50 feet. I thought I saw Sarah Packer on earlier. She might be able to say otherwise, but it depends on the type of line, and that doesn't mean that that entire width will be mowed clear. Generally, they try to keep trees at least 10 feet away from the utility line. Can you remind me what the second part of her question was, Gwen?
How do towns and utilities share management of lines along roads?
Right. So mostly it's the utility company that will manage vegetation. They tend to do a lot of clearing every X number of years, 7, 8, 9, 10 years. That's kind of changing as we address ash tree decline. But there are thousands and thousands of miles of utility lines that will not be maybe addressed or cleared as quickly as some towns might like them to be. Generally, the utility takes charge of vegetation management, but the town may want to reach out to their utility company, not only to maybe address concerns, for example, a 80-foot ash tree on the other side of the road from the utility may in fact impact the utility line, and the utility company might like to know about it. Some utilities have said, we are overwhelmed, we don't want your data. Others have said, yeah, we would like to know, maybe we can safely take down the tree and the town can clear that. The flip side is the vegetation utility companies all have vegetation management plans. And so in the towns I've worked with, I've pointed them towards those vegetation management plans for the utility companies in their town. Certainly reading them and understanding what their priorities are is a great first start. And voicing concerns to your local office there is really good to know too. The utilities do want to keep the lines clear. There are some types of trees that they appreciate and like having, but as you can imagine, any large wavy trees by utility lines are ultimately going to become a hazard for the lines and then for anyone who's managing them. There is an interactive like utility map. You may know in your town what utility companies you have anyway, but on our state website it's called the Interactive Public Utilities Map, and you can kind of go in and see which utilities companies cover your area and find their vegetation management plans.
Great. And then one question from Michael Quinn. If the town charter does not address tree wardens, does the wording revert to state statute?
As far as I know, yes. Yeah. So the state statute requires that every town has a tree warden. I do know of 1 or 2 towns where they've kind of undone that and made the select board the default tree warden. I don't quite understand the legalities of that, I'm afraid. I can look into it, or Vermont League in Cities and Towns is a great partner for those questions. Some towns they don't have a tree warden, and they should, but we don't have this kind of capacity to go around monitor that. But as far as I know, it does default to the Vermont State Tree Warden statutes.
Okay, and one last question. If a town claims a road for road mileage funding, is the town also responsible for right-of-way management on that road? Does road class status matter?
Good question. So road mileage, as in they're getting state funding based on the miles of road that they have. And generally, towns are maintaining class 2 and 3 roads. Occasionally parts of class 1 roads, but not usually. So maybe you're asking about class 4 roads in particular, which tend to be those little back roads that the town does not maintain beyond perhaps grading it once a year or something like that. I don't know entirely the answer to this question. I think that if the town is claiming that as managed road, then they do also manage the vegetation in the right of way. They have that ability to do so. That's going to be my best guess.
Okay, I think that answers all of our questions. So thank you all for your time to join us today. Although this is the end of our Arbor Day webinar series, we're starting another 5-week series on town forest recreation management starting on Tuesdays, starting at 10. So stay tuned for more information about that. I'll send it out. Joanne, thank you so much for your time and expertise on rural roads. You really are our rural road expert here. So thank you all, and I'll send out the recording as soon as it's processed. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you all.